Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to a fresh episode of Habib Talks. My name is Dr. Mohammed Haris. I teach philosophy as part of the program in Comparative Humanities at Habib University, and I also serve as the director for the program in Comparative Humanities. With me today, I have Dr. Oludamini Ogunnaike, who is Associate Professor of African Religious Thought at the University of Virginia. Dr. Ogunnaike is genuinely interdisciplinary scholar and thinker in the field of the humanities with special interest and expertise in the area of comparative philosophy, comparative religion, and really has nurtured expertise in the study of West African Sufi traditions, specifically Tijani and Ifa traditions. So with that, let me give it to Dr. Ogunnaike, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for having me here with you. I'm very excited to be here at Habib University. Very excited to learn about the mission of the university and see the way it's being put into practice. I think in the kind of post-colonial, decolonial moments, what Habib University is trying to do, what I understand the mission of Habib University is really of the utmost importance, not just for people in Pakistan, but really for people all over the world. It's the kind of current way in which we've been going about doing things. We can clearly see environmentally, politically, ethically, can't last. It's not sustainable. And so finding alternatives based on and in conversation with pre-colonial traditions of knowledge, learning, ethics is of the utmost importance, both locally and globally.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ogunnaike. So I have, let's say 5 questions for you today, and all 5 questions in one way or the other emerge out of this really brilliant and fascinating book that you published in the year 2020 called Deep Knowledge.
Yes, thank you.
So my first question, pertains to the very title of the book,
Yes.
The Question of Knowledge, because I understand that you have been thinking philosophically about the question of knowledge, about the problem of knowledge for the last many years,
Yes.
and the book is a sort of fruition of that activity, and you of course continue to speak about, think about, write about the problem of knowledge. What are some of the tracks and pathways that you've taken to the problem of knowledge? How does your project about knowledge, exploration of knowledge, relate to the history of philosophical thought, going back to sources in Plato,
Right.
and then running through the living intellectual philosophical traditions of the West African world, and then how do you trace your research and your study of the problem of knowledge to the contemporary crises in knowledge, where the problem of knowledge has really become more like a problem of crisis,
Yes,
of lack
yes.
of knowledge and non-knowledge.
Non-knowledge. I think I'll start with where you ended. So we have a big crisis of knowledge today. In the US, they talk about fake news all the time. Anybody can get on YouTube and say anything, and how do you know that it's correct? So the problem of verification, the epistemological problem of which sources do you know to trust, how do you know to trust them, what are the criteria of knowledge? But even personally, how do you know when you know something? My own kind of exploration into the philosophy of knowledge was provoked by a kind of, I hadn't read Ghazali at the time, but a kind of Ghazalian-like crisis where I was questioning whether all of the things I'd been learning at school, how could I trust them? Was it just on the basis of the authority of my teachers? If I had been doing rational or geometric proofs, how did I know that would lead to certainty? And so I had this kind of vertigo-inducing epistemological crisis when I was a teenager, and that kind of led me down the road of investigating this problem of knowledge, and led me to investigate lots of different ways in which this problem has been answered in various philosophical traditions. Recourse to theories of power, recourses to kind of mystical certainty, in the case of Ghazali, recourse to therapeutic and meditative techniques in the case of Buddhist as well as Islamic philosophical traditions. So all of these I had been exploring, and I chose to focus my research on these two traditions in West Africa, which I've been familiar with from my childhood, which made these claims of knowledge, which seemed repeatable, verifiable. Almost everybody in the society has some degree of respect for them, but which from my Western schooling and formation made absolutely no sense. The fact that let's say as a Tijani, you can go into a room and repeat a prayer, Salatul Fatih, a certain number of times, and that will give you knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, makes absolutely no sense in any of the epistemological frameworks in which I was trained. Or within the case of Ifa, people do divination, and they give people answers to their problems that most people, I would say, even a lot of people who are Western trained, trust to this day. People will go see Babalao for all kinds of issues, priests of Ifa. So this was something that, from my upbringing, I had been curious. How is it that these things seem to work, seem to not necessarily produce knowledge, because knowledge in these traditions isn't produced, it's revealed, it's transmitted. But how is it that these traditions are able to give you access to knowledge in a way that's completely different from anything that I had seen in my formation, and indeed didn't make sense within the traditions in which I had been trained formally. So I began my investigations by going to Nigeria and Senegal and interviewing people and asking them questions about, okay, what is knowledge? How is it acquired? How is it verified? But everybody told me, this is not how you're going to learn this. They said, just answering these questions isn't. So one Babalao told me, he said, just sit with me, memorize the Odu, memorize this orature, assist me in these things. And as you start to do as I do, you'll start to see the world the same way I see the world. And he was right. So the process of acquiring knowledge was very different from the kind of process of acquiring knowledge, even in my research that I had been trained in. So there's some anthropological research methods that also have talked about this, but it was quite an experience to undergo this kind of not full in it, but a kind of initiation into these traditions. And then that's what allowed me to really investigate and kind of get inside and understand how knowledge worked in these traditions, and to see them as epistemological traditions, every bit as valid, and in some cases I argue in the book even kind of more robust than the contemporary Western accounts in which I had been trained in the academy. And the conclusion I came to is that in both these traditions, and they're very different. They're very different traditions. One Islamic Sufi tradition, one an indigenous African tradition, but they both kind of come back to certainty in those traditions is found, and the highest pitch of knowledge is found in self-knowledge, because there's no intermediary between the knowing subject and the known object. But in order for this highest pitch of knowledge to come about, it requires self-cultivation. So it requires very rigorous ethical formation, ethical both in terms of taboos of things that you do, things that you don't do, but then also social ethics and lots of ritual transformation of the knowing subject. And that is what becomes productive of a different way of seeing the world. In some ways, it's not so far off. I mean, you move to a different place, you have a child, you get married, all of a sudden the world looks a little bit different. But these are kind of very intense, rigorous programs of ritual transformation. And as I argue in the book, it's not so different as a certain way of looking at schools of ancient philosophy from Pierre Hadot and Cooper and others who argue that they really should be understood as ways of life. These ancient philosophical traditions, whether the Stoics or the Skeptics or the Platonists, Neoplatonists, Epicureans, etc., they were establishing ways of life, and those ways of life would produce a certain mode of being, which would also produce a kind of certain way of looking at the world and speaking about the world. But the purpose of the discourse was actually the way of life. And philosophy wasn't just about generating discourse. It was about generating wisdom. It was about producing sages, wise people. And I think there's a lot of family resemblances between these contemporary traditions, which are very thriving in West Africa, and these ancient philosophical schools. And that they generate a lot of discourse about knowledge and this, but at the end of the day, the point of the discourse is not the discourse itself. It's not to generate a theory of knowledge, but it's actually to generate wise people, ethical people who live well, and as a result of living well, see the world in a particularly felicitous way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ogunnaike. So now, one of the really deep and fascinating aspects of your project is, and this is perhaps encapsulated in a line that I found in your book, that philosophy is not about the generation of concepts, rather it is about living and being and becoming. And what you're doing in the book, which actually gels with work done by some other thinkers elsewhere, not especially in the what I've observed in the Latin American worlds, in the Amazonian worlds, with the work going on in post-structuralist philosophical anthropology in figures such as Viveros de Castro, is this idea that you are going to the other, like in this case, the practitioners of Tijani and Ifa Sufism, not in order to document a certain kind of practice, but to actually do philosophy with them, which in turn then involves becoming. Becoming, you have to, you spend time with the Ifa masters, and you become Ifa. After that's the kind of extent, purpose, and so you've written the book also precisely as you say that this is for a 17-year-old reader who's going to pick up this book and get out of it what they would get out of reading Hegel or Kant, as in because those canonical figures are also writing so that you read and then you become in a certain way, you adopt a certain worldview perspective precisely. So if you can expand on that a little bit as to what it means to study these traditions in order to lay out an intellectual discourse, which is precisely not just discourse, but it's a way of being with and becoming.
No, that's one of the main points of the work, is I didn't want to write another anthropological work where I just document these are these people in Africa and they do this and they do that, and there's some value in that, but I wanted to take the traditions at the same level of the theories that are often used to interrogate them. That is, if you can use Foucault or use Levi-Strauss or something to study Ifa, or study the Tijaniya, or use Bourdieu or something like that, what would happen if we took the tradition of the Tijaniya or Ifa at the same level as Bourdieu? Right? They're speaking about knowledge, its concomitants, the social construction of what happens if we take them at the same level? Or what happens even if we read Bourdieu or these other thinkers through the lens of Ifa or the Tijaniya? So that was mainly what I wanted to do. And so what I wanted to do was first I had to gain a kind of fluency in those traditions. So I like to use the linguistic metaphor sometimes. So you try to, instead of just saying, okay, translating and going from, okay, this term in this language or this tradition is equivalent to this one, first you have to kind of gain fluency in the tradition on its own terms. So understand how the tradition gives an account of itself on its own terms. And once you have a certain degree of fluency in it, just like if you have a degree of fluency in a language on its own terms, that is, you define a term in that language within the language, then you can go and speak about and engage with other traditions, other languages from the point. So the idea is that these traditions are not just things to think about and write about from external positions, but they're traditions that can be learned, that can be participated in, that can be thought with, that can be thought from. Just like you learn and get trained in, let's say, Marxism or post-structuralist anthropological theory or anything else like that. If we take these traditions seriously on their own terms, our canon is broadened, and our ability to think through things is significantly expanded. I mean, maybe nobody except for So I mean, some of my students will do like a Sufi reading of Hegel, but people will do a Hegelian reading of, or do a, let's say, a psychoanalytic reading of Sufism. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. You can do a Sufi critique of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Why not? And the reason that it's done mostly the other way has mainly to do with power. It's not like I think Lacan is more profound than Ibn Arabi, but there are more machine guns and there's more money behind the discourses of Lacan. If the Ottomans had machine guns, it would be the other way around. So I think it's an intellectually important and very fruitful exercise to learn these traditions as much as one can on their own terms, and then learn to think through them, to think with them. It's a kind of intellectual multilingualism that can be developed.
Like my third question here ties in with what you were just saying, that in a world where there is such sheer diversity
Yes.
of perspective, and in fact we live in a world which is not a world, it's
Yes.
like a multiplicity of worlds. How comes it that when we still, whether it's the Western world or even in our part of the world, when we look at the academy, there is a preponderance of certain kinds of approaches and methodologies, and profound though they may be in their own ways, but then there is this very limited, and that like you don't really find in the academy, in the humanities as well as elsewhere in other disciplines, a reflection of the kind of sheer multiplicity and diversity there has been in human life, in human history. And now I think you do something very interesting with this problem in your deep knowledge book, which is that you tie the problem of knowledge and the analysis of epistemology with a genealogical assessment of modern racism.
Yes.
Like you trace out this particular, genealogical trajectory and line, as in like you trace out the origin sort of of modern racism with certain epistemological regimes that emerged out of what is known as the project of modernity, of enlightenment.
Yes.
So if you can expand on that, and then how does this, like the genealogy that you have for modern racism, like how does it speak to the way race happens and race works in our world today at global scales, and not just in the academy, but outside the academy?
Right. All right. That's a big question. But basically, the story I tell, or the genealogy I trace in the book, I mean, I should be clear, when I'm talking about modern racism, I'm talking about a very particular form of racism, which is based on biology, based on a hierarchization of human beings based on biology. So there's always been xenophobia, ethnocentrism, chauvinism of various kinds. Ancient Greeks talked about the word barbarian, which is non-Greek. There's always been these kinds of different chauvinisms around amongst different people, but it didn't take the form that we now think of when we say racism in kind of modern times. We have in mind this kind of hierarchy of people are categorized into races based on biology, their inherited characteristics, and that's a uniquely modern thing. So I was interested in how did this come about, and it's a rather complicated story, but I trace it to certain epistemological shifts that you have in the late medieval period, which lead to certain cosmological shifts. So what happens in the kind of early medieval period, you had essentially three kind of main faculties of knowledge. So you have in Latin, intellectus, ratio, and sensus. In Greek, nous, dianoia, and aesthesis. So intellectus is what allows you to know kind of the archetypes, the divine realities directly. It's a kind of spiritual, metaphysical faculty. Ratio is kind of very familiar to us as everyday reason. And then sensus is our senses. And what starts to happen with development of Occam and other people is the intellectus gets collapsed down to the ratio. And so you even see this later on in the translations of Greek texts. Nous just gets translated as reason.
Reason, right.
But it's not reason in Greek at all. There's a whole separate term for that, dianoia. So nous has much to do with this kind of more spiritual, we would perhaps say in modern terms, or kind of metaphysical thing of perceiving the archetypes, the archetypal reality. So as this faculty kind of falls off, this affects the cosmology, which at the time and still kind of today is governed by this idea called the Great Chain of Being. It's a great book by A.O. Lovejoy on this. The Great Chain of Being is basically a way of structuring and hierarchizing the cosmos based on roughly two principles. There's a particular ideal that's at the top, and your rank on the chain is based on your similarity to that ideal on the top. And difference in kind is equivalent to difference in rank, more or less. So you have a hierarchized cosmos based on similarity to a particular ideal at the top. So in ancient Greek times, and then it was taken up in the Christian tradition, you have a transcendent ideal. Right? So first, the one, the good, then God in the Christian tradition. And this is directly perceived by the nous, generally, or closely directly perceived by the nous. As the nous falls off, then the God and the one is still kind of there in the background, but it's no longer directly perceived, right? So like Leibniz was the last philosopher to talk about angels seriously. That kind of spiritual level no longer is part of philosophy and science, whereas before it was. And so you get basically the top of the great chain of being falls off. And so if you just have your reason and your senses, then who's left on the top of the great chain of being? Another important aspect too is the nous was the thing that marked humankind as being made in the image of God. It was called the Imago Dei. And so that was what put people on top of the created order, let's say. So when the nous gets reduced to ratio, reason becomes the thing that marks you as being human. And as the top of the great chain of being falls off, you have people now, human beings on the top. But now it's an immanent ideal, no longer a transcendent ideal. And because it's an immanent ideal, it's a particular kind of human being, not human beings as such. And it's a particular kind of rationality that marks your kind of role, role as being at the top of the great chain of being. So what you end up happening is you lose the kind of hierarchy of angels, and it then gets replaced by a hierarchy of people, races based on rationality. So let's say, and you see this historically in the Enlightenment, Japanese are better than Chinese, Persians are better than Arabs, everybody's better than Africans and Native Americans because these people are more rational. And so philosophy then, particularly in the Enlightenment period, becomes a demonstration of the rational faculty and becomes a marker of humanity, of civilization. So it becomes to fulfill this function of demonstrating full humanity. And also certain people in certain geographical regions get written out of the history of philosophy, particularly in the 18th century. So Egypt gets written out of, China gets written out of the history of philosophy as this kind of thinking progresses. And then with Kant, it becomes biologized and more static. With Hegel, and Kant as well too, it becomes temporalized. So they take the great chain of being, which was kind of static over time, and they temporalize it. So you have this notion of progress. So people will say, I can't believe this is happening, it's 2023. It's a direct result of this tilting of making the great chain of being temporal with the future, future driven by this rational faculty. So and it's just become part of the general zeitgeist. But if you trace back this genealogy, you can see where it comes from, and you can see the rather unfortunate consequences of it today. And there are lots of memes and jokes about this. So they have like a tragedy world map, right? So if 10 people die in the US or Canada or Britain, that's the equivalent to 1,000 people dying in the Middle East, or 10,000 people dying in South Asia, or 100,000 people dying in Africa, in terms of how much world news it makes, how grievable they are, to use Judith Butler's term. And it has to do with this ranking of humanity. that even though we officially deny this, we say, oh no, all lives are precious and equal. That's not the way it actually works. And that ranking is still very much the kind of practical ranking in terms of how much we grieve, how newsworthy certain lives and certain people are, still very much follows that modified great chain of being in the Enlightenment with its racial hierarchies today. Of course, somewhat modified, but so that's roughly the genealogy. There are certain epistemological shifts that lead to cosmological shifts, which then lead to different ways of organizing people and thinking about what is it that makes people worthy, more human than others. And that explains this. There's another thinker who has a similar, distinct, but very similar accounts of this kind of development of racism called Sylvia Wynter, Wynter. It's very good. Again, describes these different cosmological shifts from what she calls the Christian heathen paradigm to the man one, rational man, and heathen, colonized Indian and enslaved African, to then what she calls man two, the eugenically selected person who succeeds in the capitalist market, and then the disselected people, those people who don't succeed in the capitalist market or are not genetically selected for. So as you get these different shifts in cosmology, you get different shifts in understandings of what a human being is, what makes a worthy human being, what makes an unworthy human being. But the main philosophical point is when you have a transcendent ideal, you can have different things that equally participate in the transcendent ideal. As soon as you have an immanent ideal, you lose that potential for ambiguity. So you can think of it like most places on the earth are roughly equidistant from the center of the earth, but not from the North Pole. Once you lose that kind of transcendence to the cosmology, to the ideal, the possibilities for equality are much narrower. So that's the main argument.
Brilliant response that you've just given, and just building up on what we've been talking about over here. One way to talk about the history of philosophy and the history of intellectual life, and this is a very rough kind of division that I'm making, is that on the one hand you have the influence of Plato and Platonism in its various forms, including the way, as you describe in your book, Platonism came into the West African traditions, where there is this persistent sort of reference or emphasis on the external referent, that no matter what the matter is, the subject is, which is being investigated, whether it's ethics or politics, aesthetics, art, so on, or matters relating to the spiritual life, you always have to have an external referent, which sort of illuminates the discussion, the dialogue, the conversation. So now that can be opposed to a different sort of philosophical attitude or disposition which you find in, like, let's say Hegel, for instance, or even in Kant, where a certain kind of immanence, so like emphasis on immanence emerges. And now like I want to tie this sort of conversation and this like division which we have outlined over here with precisely an emphasis on immanence, which is being made by some scholars and thinkers writing today who have a project which is also a project aimed at the decolonization of knowledge, which I understand is also a project that you have.
Yes.
Just to the decolonizing of philosophy, the decolonizing of religious studies and of knowledge in general. So how do you reconcile this project of the decolonization of knowledge with now like what you're doing with Islam specifically? Because isn't it the case that then Islam gets tangled up in processes of colonization and imperial domination which have been underway, and in what ways then Islam becomes precisely a sort of colonizing tradition, if I may say, as in comparison with the continuous sort of indigenous traditions and worlds of knowing and being, and,
Right.
and especially in West Africa and other parts of the world. So that's
Okay, it's a big provocation. So there's colonization and there's colonization, right? So in fact, even indigenous Yoruba traditions, they formed empires. We had the Oyo Empire, Ife Empire, the other African empires where people practiced indigenous African religions. Those empires, though, were generally very like the Mongols. There was no enforcement of religious, linguistic homogeneity at all. These traditions very much recognize it's assumed everybody has their own particular tradition, their own particular way of doing things. And so, for example, when Islam came into Yoruba lands, the Prophet Muhammad was just added as an Orisha. When Christianity came, initially Jesus was also just added as an Orisha. And people would actually practice multiple different, just like they practice multiple different Orisha traditions at the same time. People would practice Christianity, Islam, and indigenous traditions simultaneously. So the joke is about Yoruba people that Yoruba people are 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, and 30% indigenous religion. It always, whenever you add up the religious affiliation, it adds up to more than 100%. Because traditionally there was,
as it should, like there is a super abundance.
There's not just super, people practice more than one. Because in the old days, you could be, let's say, practice a devotee of Oshun, who's the Orisha of kind of love and beauty. And you could also be a devotee of Shango, the Orisha of lightning, justice, things like that. They're not mutually exclusive traditions. And so when Islam and Christianity came, they were interpreted in that mold. So that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. Now, bringing this to the notion of transcendence, the idea that kind of makes this way of engaging religiously kind of possible, or grounds it within the Yoruba, the Orisha tradition, is Olodumare Olodumare being kind of God, is so high and transcendent that you can't relate to him directly. He kind of is beyond all relationality. And so you have these different paths, these different traditions that lead to him. And he's so transcendent that it's not like you need to have exclusive allegiance to Olodumare. There are multiple different paths. The Yoruba proverb says that the marketplace has more than one entrance. So it's precisely the kind of grounding in the transcendent reality of Olodumare that allows for this plurality of religious traditions and paths, and just the assumption that everybody has their tradition, everybody has their path, so you should let them do that. Now, and this is now coming to the Islam question, something that's similar that you particularly find in Sufism, particularly Akbari Sufism, the tradition of Ibn Arabi, is Olodumare is not only transcendent, but in a certain sense is so transcendent that he must transcend his transcendence and be immanent in or as all things and in all traditions. So the way Ibn Arabi makes this argument is that if God is just transcendent, if God is just non-delimited, then in a certain sense you've limited him. So I say God transcends this room, and I say God can't be in this room, right? Then I've limited God somehow. So to be truly transcendent is to be transcendent, but also to transcend transcendence, and then also to be immanent in or as everything. So in both of these traditions, and I think you find this in certain forms of Neoplatonism as well too. That's part of the problem the Neoplatonists had with the Gnostics, is you can't limit absolute reality in this way by making it simply transcendent. But once you do that, once you accept that kind of transcendence of transcendence, then you have this both transcendence and immanence together, which allows for this recognition of plurality, because you recognize precisely the absolute in all of these delimited forms. So you see that very strongly in the Ibn Arabi tradition. Now, bringing this to the actual like practical social implications of this. So in the Tijani tradition, Shaykh Ahmed Tijani has pretty much said that don't elevate yourself above God by elevating yourself above any of his creatures, even the disbelievers. because God is, they're all just tajalliyat, manifestations of the divine reality. And so if you think you're better than them, you're elevating yourself above God. So there is, at the one hand, a kind of hierarchy of those who know, who recognize reality more than others. But if you ascend to the top of that hierarchy, it all gets kind of flattened out. And this is one of the things that I think allowed for the flourishing of plural religious, linguistic, and other communities under Islamic rule. So when the Muslims would go and take over a place, in general, not always, but in general, it wasn't, here's a sword, you have to convert. It wasn't convert by the sword. People continue to practice their traditions. They're allowed to practice their traditions. Very rarely do you have the kind of suppression of languages as well. It's very different from what we saw in many cases under European colonialism, in which there was attempted and in some cases successful genocides, epistemicides, wiping out of different forms of knowledge. It does happen in Islamic history. I'm not going to try to whitewash Islamic history, the colonial, imperial powers, but under the Ottoman Empire, for example, if you were an Armenian Christian, you could live, still speak Armenian, still practice Armenian Orthodox Christianity, even be judged according to Armenian Orthodox law. Very different thing when you're, let's say, ruled by the French or the British or the Italians or the Germans who have you in many different situations. And I think it is in part related to this idea of what is the ideal? Is the ideal transcendent or is it immanent? If it's an immanent ideal, that overrepresents itself as being universal, right? So if I have a particular form of rationality and I say this is universal rationality, what do I do with people who have different kinds of rationality? If I say this is religion and I say it's a particular form of religiosity or tradition, and I say this is universal, what do I do with the people who do something different? It has to become deviant, it has to become a lesser form, and it has to be eliminated through homogenizing violence. Otherwise, the universality of my particular can't be upheld. So if I have a very particular form that I overrepresent, that I conflate with being a universal, then I have to deal with all of these other particulars. If I have something that transcends the particular or that opens up onto something that's beyond the particular, then I can coexist with other particulars. They don't pose an existential threat to the claims about me or my tradition and things like that. And you see that very, very clearly in the indigenous African traditions. They don't even care. You can practice multiple at the same time. Islam is a bit in the middle. And then I think on the other extreme, you see a lot of these kind of Western philosophical Christian and post-Christian traditions in which this is what religion is, this is what rationality is, this is what civilization is, and the rest of you need to come along and conform with this or be eliminated. And so that's how I see these things kind of working. And the project of decolonization, I think, is precisely this colonial model of a particular overrepresenting itself as a universal and the eliminative, homogenizing violence that precisely defines colonialism as there's the colonizer who has the universal and the colonized who has the particular. That's what has to be undone. And that's why I see these other traditions as being such important resources and examples of trying to recover or repair a world that's pluriversal. Because I think that's the way the world actually is. As you began the question, there are multiple worlds. There's so many different ways of being human, of cultivating character, and that's just the way the world is. And to pretend that there's only one way of thinking, there's only one way of governing, and we all live in nation states now. There's only one way of doing this kind of homogenizing, eliminative force is not, it doesn't correspond with reality. It's not good. It's not good for us in all kinds of ways. And so that's how I think it relates to the project of decolonization. And that's why I think it's so important. And that's actually something I think some of the kind of Deleuze and Guattari inspired anthropologists actually miss out when they're engaging with these traditions. So they engage with them but they kind of translate them into a Deleuzian framework. And of course, there are aspects, you read Ibn Arabi, there's lots of resonances with Deleuze, but he's not Deleuze. They're different things. These Amazonian shamans, they're not Deleuze. They have hierarchies, they have perspectival different ways of seeing things, and those differences are important, and they need to be respected. And just because an Amazonian shaman might have some things that are different from Deleuze doesn't mean it's not valuable, it's not important. Those differences aren't privations, they're not a lack. It's in many ways, it's a plenitude. Because if you want to learn Deleuze, you can just go read Deleuze. You don't need, Deleuze in Amazonian form. The differences are actually a plenitude. It just adds to the diversity, to the kind of possibilities of being human that we have. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot more to say on that, but that's how I think about it.
It's a very thought-provoking response, and of course, that can be an ongoing, longer conversation.
Yes.
I have a final question for you, because I can see in your project, in Deep Knowledge, you ultimately bring the question and this philosophical exploration of knowledge to the question of self-knowledge then.
Yes.
And the pursuit and the search for self-knowledge, which is, I guess, to use a non-decolonial sort of term, it is like one of the classically, quote unquote, significant philosophical questions, which like the way the history of philosophy is sort of, presented to us. Now, if you can share some insights with us about how your forays into the West African Sufi traditions of the Ifa and Tijani, and then the comparative philosophy that you've done in your book, engaging major figures and traditions within what is known as the Western philosophical traditions, and how you come out with, and you make this sort of very, what I think is an impassioned plea to the reader that find your true self. And here are some path marks, some sort of frameworks, some ideas, as well as some spiritual practices of being and knowing that you can, adopt.
Right.
So if you can share some of those insights.
So the oracle at Delphi famously said, "Know yourself, know thyself." And what I've learned from these traditions is that the process of coming to know yourself is a process of self-cultivation. Paradoxically, it's a process of changing yourself to become who you are. And this is something that you see in a lot of different traditions. Part of it has to do with the different temporalities. So we have your kind of in-time persona, personality, mask, and then you have kind of who you are in the Sufi tradition, Endallah, in Divinis. In the Ifa tradition, your Ori, which is the kind of...
the ever-living present, what is known as the ethnographic present.
The ethnographic present, but then beyond, this is kind of beyond time, and it's kind of metaphysical self, but it requires a lot of work and discipline in order to become who you are. I'm a musician as well too, so Miles Davis said, it takes a lot of practice to sound like yourself. You've got to work hard to find your voice, to kind of find who you are, what you like, what's your sound on your instrument. And so these traditions are traditions of self-cultivation, ethical, spiritual, intellectual, that in essence allow you to find your voice. And that's something that a lot of people are looking for today, particularly as we're in this kind of climate of homogenization, where you have the same news outlets repeating the same talking points, which are then echoed by people, and it can be very difficult to not just get washed away.
And there seems to be homogenization around wokeness also, like that.
Yes, yeah.
One way in which
there's one set of opinions on everything. Again, it's a kind of homogenizing violence that's pushing people to dress the same, eat the same, think the same, talk the same. It's like that. If you compare that to 2 generations ago, almost anywhere in the world, very different, much wider spectrum of ways of being human. And in part, these traditions play an important way in... I've never met people who are kind of more unique than these communities of Sufis and Babalao. It's odd because they're going through very similar programs of self-cultivation and very strict ritual observance, but it produces all of these different outcomes. So that the same or very similar ritual programs will produce people who are very confidently different from others, but because they kind of share this grounding, it's all right. They don't feel the need to force others to have the exact same opinions that they do, or to dress the same or speak the same as they do. It's a kind of paradoxical. In fact, one way you can think about it is if you look at gymnasts or breakdancers, they go through a lot of discipline and training, but it gives them a tremendous freedom of movement. More so if I just put on some music and told you dance, if you had no training, you'd do the same 3 or 4 moves and that's it, you'd be limited. But through lots of discipline and training, you actually become more free in what you can do, what the possibilities are. And so these and other traditions of ethical and spiritual cultivation like that, paradoxically, the discipline opens up the possibilities of freedom and ways of being human.
This is so brilliant, so fascinating. So thank you very much again, Dr. Oludamini Ogunnaike, for this wonderfully illuminating conversation. Genuinely learned so much from you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And I would like to thank the audience for giving us company, for joining us for this episode of Habib Talks. We'll be looking forward to having you here with us in the next episode of Habib Talks. So thank you very much. Take care of yourself.